Penguin Random House Audio presents The Flying Tigers, the untold story of the American pilots who waged a secret war against Japan, by Sam Kleiner, read for you by Stephen Graybill. Introduction. The freezing temperatures in New York City on December 7, 1941, didn't stop more than 55,000 football fans from packing the stands at the Polo Grounds in Upper Manhattan. This was the highly anticipated crosstown rivalry game between the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. After the underdog Dodgers took a 7-0 lead, they kicked the ball down the field, and listeners at home heard the announcer on WOR radio call the play. "It's a long one, down to around the 3-yard line," he said. And the Giants' Ward Cuff made the catch and started to run it down the field. Over the cheers of the crowd, the announcer continued, "Cuff's still going. He's up to the 25, and now he's hit hard, about the 27-yard line. Bruiser Kennard made the tack—" Suddenly the reporting of the game was cut off as another voice broke in. "We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Stay tuned to WOR for further developments, which will be broadcast immediately as received." Inside the stadium, the game went on without any kind of announcement. The crowd watched as the Brooklyn Dodgers clinched an upset 21-7 victory. The sun was setting as the fans headed for the exits. Then the public address system came on. "All Navy men in the audience are ordered to report to their posts immediately. All Army men are to report to their posts tomorrow morning. This is important." There was a sudden startled buzz in the crowd, the sports writer for the Brooklyn Eagle reported. What had happened? No one knew. Not until he got close to the nearest radio or within hearing range of newsboys yelling in the streets. The Navy Department's censors delayed releasing photographs of the destruction in Hawaii, but on December 29th, Time magazine featured them in its coverage of the havoc in Honolulu. One image showed large clouds of black smoke rising from the wreckage of the USS Arizona, and another, a P-40 fighter plane that had been wrecked on the field and never fought. A hangar at the Army's Hickam Field had also been destroyed. This was the carnage from Japan's sneak attack. Time carried a dire headline in that December 29th issue, Invasion of the U.S.? It reported that anti-aircraft guns were deployed in New York City to defend power plants, aircraft factories, docks, and shipyards against the threat of the Luftwaffe attack. The fear was more pronounced in the West. At forest fire lookout towers, in little tar paper-covered shacks scattered on the hills along the coast, spotters watched the gray skies 24 hours a day in 3-hour shifts. San Francisco was blacked out, and reporter Ernie Pyle said that its darkened streets looked like the dusty remnants of a city dead and uninhabited for 100 years. But that edition of Time included another story, one that would capture the imaginations and raise the hopes of Americans in the dark days after Pearl Harbor. In China, a unit of U.S. volunteers was battling the Imperial Japanese Air Force, whose planes had been bombing Chinese cities and killing thousands of civilians for the past 4 years. They were known as the Flying Tigers, and Time reported their exploits in stirring fashion. Last week, 10 Japanese bombers came winging their carefree way up into China, heading directly for Kunming. The Flying Tigers swooped, let the Japanese have it. Of the 10 bombers, said Chinese reports, 4 plummeted to earth in flames. The rest turned tail and fled. Tiger casualties? None. Members of the Tigers would soon become familiar figures, their leader, Colonel Claire Chennault, and pilots like David Tex Hill and Scarsdale Jack Newkirk. Years before American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy or raised the flag on Iwo Jima, it was Chennault's Flying Tigers who rallied the country with victories when the Axis forces appeared unstoppable. 100 American volunteers had taken the measure of the enemy, Claire Booth wrote in Life. Who, in the face of that measure, dared doubt that America could, if it would, defeat Japan? The Flying Tigers' shark-nosed P-40s, also known as Tomahawks, would go down in history as one of the iconic images from World War II. Hollywood executives knew a heroic story when they saw one, and in 1942, Republic Pictures rushed out Flying Tigers, starring John Wayne as the swashbuckling commander of the unit. Hollywood produced its own version of their adventures, but the truth was that the pilots were doing deeds that a movie director would reject in a script as too fantastic, as Time described them in April 1942. Despite the hyperbole, the Flying Tigers were indeed undertaking an important mission. They helped to keep China in the war. If China fell, Japan would be able to focus its forces against an unprepared and underarmed United States. It would take 5 decades for the Pentagon to acknowledge the truth about the Flying Tigers, namely that the mission was a covert operation authorized at the highest levels of the Roosevelt White House, in violation of America's neutrality and out of view of an isolationist Congress, months before Pearl Harbor. Its pilots and ground crew resigned from the U.S. military, bade their loved ones farewell, and crossed the Pacific on ocean liners, carrying passports listing false professions to disguise the truth about their mission. Over 100 pilots arrived at a makeshift camp in the jungles of Burma to discover planes many didn't know how to fly. Determined and desperate, they drilled in new techniques to fight the Japanese Air Force's more agile planes, and were just about to enter into battle when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor. When President Roosevelt declared war, they were practically behind enemy lines, outnumbered and with no reinforcements coming. Yet between December 20th, 1941 and July 4th, 1942, they shot down scores of Japanese planes in Burma and southern China. For over 75 years, the most detailed accounts of the Flying Tigers lay buried in pilots' diaries and letters that were hidden away, in closets and at the backs of drawers after the war, and in combat reports that lay moldering in the basement of an unremarkable brick building in Georgetown. Their achievements are even more remarkable and stirring than the myth created by Hollywood. The story of the Flying Tigers begins with a boy growing up in rural Louisiana with dreams of seeing the world. Chapter 1. Dancing in the Sky. To understand Claire Chennault, you have to trace his roots to the backwoods of northeast Louisiana. The Chennault house was a few miles south of Gilbert, a town of just a few hundred people. Raised up several feet to protect it from the floods that plagued the flatlands, the house was a small single-story cottage with gingerbread trim and an inviting porch in the back. It was a modest abode, but it was the pride of John Chennault, Claire's father, a cotton farmer who had built the house with his own hands in 1905 when Claire was a boy. Claire Chennault would fondly recall roaming the oak woods and moss-draped cypress swamps of the Mississippi floodplains in northeast Louisiana. The Tensas River Basin was Chennault's childhood playground. He spent time hunting and fishing by himself in the swamps. As he grew older, his father would let him go on treks for days at a time. Claire would take a fishing rod and survive on whatever he could catch, frying catfish and bream with a slab of bacon. He would live in a lean-to he built out of tree branches and sleep on a pile of leaves, and when he wanted to bathe, would jump in a watering hole. He shot his first gun, a Winchester rifle, at the age of 8 and soon graduated to shooting squirrels. He learned how to build a pyramid trap, a box that was held up by a twig with some oat or cornflakes as bait. He became self-reliant during this idyllic childhood, which resembled that of the hero of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, one of his favorite books. His solitary adventures in the woods, however, may have masked a darker side of his childhood. His mother died when he was only 5, and a stepmother he loved passed away a few years later. The woods were always there for him. Chennault also had a vivid imagination that drew him to distant lands, and he dreamt of someday seeing more of the world. Although he didn't excel at school, He didn't like following instructions.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?